Great. So I was thinking about this talk earlier this evening as I was going for a walk around my neighborhood. And I was thinking about the Buddha's search and the extent to which it was compelled by suffering and dissatisfaction. And the way we all embark on a search like this of sorts, sometimes in a very overt way. Sometimes we leave our work, or we leave a relationship, or we leave a situation that hasn't been serving us, and we embark into the unknown, knowing that something better is out there for us. Or it can be on a smaller scale. Like when I went out today for my walk, I knew that I didn't feel quite right. And so I was on that walk trying to connect with my feet, walking very mindfully and slowly, noticing the air. And as I did that, I was kind of soothing myself and sensing into a greater possibility. I was noticing the fact that I do have the capacity to train and soothe my own mind and connect with something bigger than my small problems, the problems that were concerning me today. So I think this search that I'm about to describe applies to us metaphorically, but also literally. And we can notice this in our own practice and our own life. Notice these moments where we're yearning for something different. And we have hope that something is out there or something is within us that might unlock some potential and some freedom. So I'm going to start the talk tonight by describing the founding myth of Buddhism, which some of you might be familiar with, because that sets the scene for the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path as it reflects some of the insights that the Buddha spoke about after his awakening, and some of the insights that he gained during his search as well, before his awakening. So I am going to say a few things that might be familiar to you. And so just let it wash over you if you're familiar with the story. Hopefully, I'll draw your attention to certain aspects of the story that inspire me and have moved me in my practice. And I hope there'll be parts of it that resonate with you as well. So, around 2,500 years ago, or a bit longer, a young man left a very privileged life in search for an answer to what he perceived as universal realities of aging, sickness, death, and unsatisfactoriness. At the time, he lived in India, and in India, there had been great advances in relation to agriculture, and there were also great advances in relation to spirituality. And so a lot of people were engaged in spiritual practices, and a lot of people were living off the land agriculturally. And this created an environment in which wandering ascetics, or people who were spiritually inclined, could wander around and learn from one another and exchange ideas and debate ideas. And so the Buddhist search unfolded through various stages, if you like. He first witnessed, after being cloistered and living a very privileged life, what he saw as shocking realities. He hadn't seen people get old, he hadn't seen people get very sick, and he hadn't seen death clearly. And so when he left his privileged life as a prince, he left the palace, he was confronted with these realities that he hadn't actually seen before. And so he wandered off and he started to study with various meditation masters. And many of these masters had actually accomplished very deep meditation states. The first master he studied with, he admired because this master was able to achieve meditation or meditative absorption on a high level. And the Buddha actually started practicing with a lot of vigor and achieved such absorption. And it's said that he reached a very, very deep state of meditation. It's called the eighth jhana in early Buddhism. But despite this high level of meditation, he realized that he still didn't feel liberated from the suffering associated with aging, sickness, and death and impermanence. And so, leaving this teacher behind, he then attempted to embrace another approach, which was that of extreme asceticism. And this was likely influenced by Jain or Jainism, which was present in Indian society at the time. And he experimented with breath holding exercises and fasting. He limited his food intake. For a while, he only survived on a single grain of rice. He was holding his breath for some time. And this was a type of extreme self-denial. And he attempted this for some time and again concluded that it didn't actually liberate him from these problems that he perceived of sickness, aging, death, and impermanence. He was engaged in these types of practices for some years, some say 6 years. And after all of this kind of unsuccessful striving and self-mortification and contortion, and repression, he recalled an experience from his childhood, which was a memory in his imagination. He remembered as a child, he was sitting beneath a rose apple tree, and as he lay there, he entered a kind of blissful meditative state, a peaceful state of mind. And as he reflected on this memory, he realized that awakening might not happen through tormenting the body or depriving the body, but rather through cultivating relaxed collectedness and tranquility in a way that is not shaped by striving or force or control. And so at this point, as the Buddha recalled this beautiful memory of his childhood, he started to become too weak to meditate effectively. And so he made the decision to resume eating. And at this point, he started to gain more energy, and some of the spiritual practitioners around him started to gossip about the fact that he'd abandoned the spiritual path. And they left him, they abandoned him. They thought he was a spiritual disappointment. But in reality, what he was doing was that he was abandoning the methods that weren't working, that weren't serving his awakening. Once his strength returned, he then sat beneath the Bodhi tree. Some of you might have gone to India and seen the Bodhi tree, which still stands and still has that kind of spiritual power and energy. I've been lucky enough to be there, and there's something very powerful about that tree and about that spot. And it was there that he entered a state of mind that was deeply concentrated and clear and steady and malleable. And the Buddha went deeper and deeper into these states of insight and absorption. And as he went deeper, he saw with more clarity his past. He was able to recollect past conditions, including his previous life, the myth says. And during the second part of the night, he was able to see beings pass away and reappear according to their karma or their past actions. And then during the last part of the night, he fully understood what's come to known as the Four Noble Truths, which I'll speak to tonight. And by dawn, he was awakened completely. And this awakening that he described was not simply an intellectual awakening, but a complete transformation of his embodied being. He remained in a state of bliss and deep understanding for about a week before he considered whether to share his discovery with others. And initially, he decided that others would not understand the truth of his insight. And so, according to the myth, he was encouraged to teach by a deity, reminding him that although many people were deeply caught in their own ignorance, others possessed only a little dust in their eyes and would be capable of understanding. And so, persuaded by this, he decided to offer his first teaching. He travelled to Sarnath, which is also a very special place in India, a deer park, where he found those ascetics who had abandoned him. And initially they dismissed him as someone who had given up the holy life, the noble life altogether. But only after he reminded them that he never previously claimed he was awakened did they agree to listen. It was there that he delivered what the tradition remembers as the first discourse of Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. And in each of these truths, there is a task connected to it, which I'll speak to in a moment. So some people in the modern Buddhist traditions like to call the Four Noble Truths the Four Ennobling Truths, because they do actually have a verb component. It's not just about knowing something, it's also about doing something and relating to reality in a certain way. And when we practice these Four Noble Truths, we become ennobled, because we become daughters, sons, children of the Buddha, enabling our own capacity for awakening and insight. So I'm going to talk you through these four truths. So the first noble truth that the Buddha offered there at the deer park in Sarnath is simply that suffering exists, and our task is to understand this. The term that the Buddha used was a Pali term, and the Pali term is dukkha. And dukkha has been translated as suffering, but it's also been translated as stress or unsatisfactoriness. And the important part about what the Buddha was saying about dukkha was that dukkha is not located in external events themselves, but rather in our relationship to reality. So, for example, if you lose your sunglasses at home, it's not the sunglasses that are causing you stress or unsatisfactoriness, but your mind's reaction to losing the sunglasses. And this insight is crucial because it means that we can and we do have the potential to shift our response. And therefore, transformation on this level is very possible. It becomes possible. And so when we think about how we might understand dukkha and face it, really this is an inside job, and perhaps it captures 99% of the Buddhist path. And so it's important not to get too stuck on words at this point, because the Buddha wasn't inviting us to understand a concept, but the Buddha was asking us to understand how dukkha presents in our own lived, embodied experience moment by moment. In a moment, I'm going to speak about view, which is part of the Eightfold Path, but I just wanted to jump ahead for a moment and say that part of wise view or right view in Buddhist terms is an understanding of this first noble truth. And so understanding this first noble truth, according to the Buddha, can lead us to a certain freedom from stress and struggle. There's a long legacy of people saying that Buddhism is somehow a negative religion. It's a religion that focuses on suffering and it gets a bit of a bad rap. But the Buddha wasn't saying that all of life was suffering in this first noble truth. The Buddha was saying that suffering exists and that we probably do experience suffering. He also wasn't saying bad luck. He wasn't saying there is suffering, bad luck. He was saying, I teach suffering and the end of suffering. And so there was a promise in the first noble truth. And the promise was that we can liberate ourselves from suffering through understanding it. The Buddha's followers were known not for being naysayers or killjoys. They were known as contented, as easeful, as peaceful and happy. And so we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this path is about being contented. It's about a deep happiness that transcends impermanence and the conditions that we experience that we might not be enjoying. There's also value, I think, in not letting ourselves get too comfortable with the term suffering, because the entire thrust of Buddhist practice is about broadening and deepening our understanding of our experience and exposing the roots of our unsatisfactory experience. And there are so many specific causes and conditions that can lead to a sense of stress or tension or dis-ease. And therefore, we go in through our mindfulness practice with a very open mind rather than trying to look for this thing that we call suffering and flattening it. We're actually going in with a sense of openness and exploring the various layers and dimensions of dukkha in our experience. So obviously we experience suffering on all sorts of levels. The most obvious level I've spoken to in the Buddha's story, and that relates to the suffering associated with having a body. We live on this material plane of existence and all that comes with it. Birth doesn't look very fun for babies, though I could be wrong. Aging isn't always fun for people. Illness, that can be a real struggle, and the process of dying. So the body itself is not producing these experiences, but the way the body presents itself and these changes in the body can lead to a lot of suffering and a lot of resistance because we become very attached to the body. There are also other dimensions of dukkha. We know that mental ill health is a widespread epidemic at the moment in modern culture. And so suffering can happen on the level of the mind. It doesn't have to pertain to the changing body. We often want certain mental experiences and get other mental experiences, or we don't want certain mental experiences, and this creates a greater aversion and tension. According to Joseph Goldstein, who's an insight meditation teacher from the US, he says that dukkha is the inevitability of unwanted experiences. So I think this is a very kind of poignant way of putting dukkha, the inevitability of unwanted experiences. We will get things we don't want, and we won't get things that we want. I think that's clear enough to all of us. Yet somehow we think it's all a mistake, that we should be getting everything we want and that we should be enjoying our happily ever after. The Buddha was saying that despite the flow of these changing conditions that are largely out of our control, we can actually respond to our situation differently from a place of deep understanding that promotes greater contentment and ease. This is from Bhikkhu Bodhi, who's a monastic in the Theravada tradition. He says, whether in the form of pain, frustration, or distress, suffering reveals the basic insecurity of the human condition. It throws before our awareness, in a way we cannot evade, the vast gulf stretching between our ingrained expectations and the possibility for their fulfillment. In a world never fully susceptible to domination by our wills, it throws before our awareness the vast gulf between what we're conditioned to think is supposed to be the way it should be and what's actually possible, because the world is not susceptible to the domination by our wills. And so we often have this misunderstanding that we have agency or willpower, and that magically can impact the world around us. The more we realize this isn't the case, paradoxically, the freer we become. And we start to embrace the fact that there are joys and sorrows in our life. And whatever comes, comes. It's not that we're helpless. It's not that we have no agency, and we can do our best to live our lives in accordance with grace and integrity. But the key here is that we are moving more in alignment with the flow of conditions rather than bucking against them. And so the Buddha was inviting us to move towards this reality of pain and suffering and unsatisfactoriness, and to understand it. Dukkha is the truth. It is the first noble truth. And if we allow ourselves to face it, then what will probably emerge is a desire to find a way out of it. And that is a very wholesome desire that I'll speak to in a moment. And so once we realize, I've been living my life on autopilot, I've been living my life imagining that I have more control than what I actually do. I've been living my life fighting against the truth of suffering. Can I look for another way? Can I reorient my life so that I can live with more grace, more ease, more presence, more acceptance? Second noble truth. The Buddha said that dukkha itself, so unsatisfactoriness, arises dependent on what he referred to as tanha, which has loosely been translated as craving, but I would be more inclined to call it a kind of unquenchable thirst that we experience. And this isn't an ordinary thirst for a cup of water. It's kind of a desperate, compelling thirst. It's the kind of thirst that you might experience when you're crossing a desert and you don't have any water. And so he said there were various forms of craving that compel us. The first is the craving for sensual pleasure, so pleasant sights, sounds, smells, tastes, sensations, that type of craving. The second is craving for becoming, the desire to become something different, wealthier, more successful, healthier, more spiritual even. And the third is craving for annihilation or non-becoming, which is wanting unpleasant experiences or to disappear completely. And you can see that very clearly in those who experience depression. Freud would have called that the death drive. So this desire to actually obliterate experience or obliterate parts of the self. And these operate on all sorts of levels, sometimes even on a semi-conscious or unconscious level. So the Buddha wasn't saying this is the only cause of suffering, but he was saying it's a necessary condition. And this truth is to be abandoned. So craving is to be abandoned, let go of, dropped when it's noticed. The third noble truth is that if craving ceases or tanha ceases, suffering also ceases. And this is to be realized. And so in a way, what we're doing is we're noticing causality. We're noticing that when we let go of craving, that we experience a moment of freedom. The principle is quite simple, and it's not really an intellectual call. It's about learning how to work with craving in our lived experience. And this happens a lot on the cushion. It's an embodied realization that happens on the cushion when we sit and practice meditation instead of following every path. I feel like you're frozen. Oh, there you are. Every path, every kind of idea, every desire. We watch desire as it arises and it lingers and then it self-abandons. We watch that process over and over and over again. And what happens is a type of purification. The mind becomes more settled, more clear. The fourth noble truth is a path. So the Buddha said, because craving can't simply be willed away, we can't just say, I don't want craving, I'm going to take Ozempic, which some people do, but I'm not suggesting that tonight. We can't simply take a pill to will away craving. We actually need to embark on some kind of training, practical training. And this training is called the Eightfold Path, the Noble Eightfold Path, which is to be developed. And so there are 8 factors on the Noble Eightfold Path, and they're not like steps on a ladder. They develop together simultaneously. They support and strengthen each other. And you can imagine when you think of the word path that it has a kind of connotation of a journey. And I don't think the Buddha was quite talking to a linear journey, but he was talking about a kind of movement of sorts. And I often like to think of the journey as a journey of descent into the depths of our being. You might have a personally meaningful way of thinking about this journey in your own life. And so T.S. Eliot said, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." So there is something somewhat circular about this journey that the Buddha's referring to. In a way, we start where, well, we end where we began, and we see what we used to see with fresh eyes, a new way of looking, a new perspective. And so in this sense, there is an exploration and a journey, but in another sense, nothing changes at all. And so this eightfold path that we are going to be presenting over the next little while, I'll just give you a brief overview of it and then I'll stop. Begins with right view. And right view is such a lovely topic. It sounds very boring, but it's one of my favorite topics because I think it's one of the Buddha's most important teachings on craving and attachment, because we do get very attached to fixed views and ways of seeing the world. And I think the Buddha's teachings are very pragmatic and open, and the invitation is actually to update our views and our understanding as our experience deepens. And so right view is also an understanding of the Four Noble Truths themselves, and more profoundly conditionality and the fact that we have, I suppose, I don't like to use the word interconnected because I think it's a bit of a flat word, but I guess what I would say is that we're entangled. We're entangled materially, but also psychically with one another. And we start to understand that on a deeper and deeper level, not just in our minds, but also in our experience. Then there's right intention, and that is about orientation. It's about renouncing the things that don't serve us, that lead to more suffering, more craving, and orienting towards goodwill and the tenderness that I pointed to in the meditation. It also relates to an intention to tend to our own suffering and the suffering of others with compassion. And so it's a caring intention, right intention, to care for ourselves, to care for our minds, to care for the world. The next 3 factors relate to ethics, or sila in Pali. Right speech, and that's pretty tricky in these times, but it means avoiding lying, abusive speech, divisive speech, gossip, and being silent when that's appropriate. Right action, avoiding killing, stealing, sexual misconduct. And Jack Cornfield often says it's hard to settle your mind after a day of killing, stealing, and raping. And so right action actually supports the conditions that we need to practice and develop that deep understanding into the Four Noble Truths that I've described. Right livelihood, what you do with your energy and your day. If possible, it would be very supportive if you could do things that benefit others, or at least do not harm others. So, for example, engaging in activism or community work or volunteer work, very wholesome, avoiding trading in weapons, avoiding slaughtering animals or occupations that involve dishonesty or exploitation. And then we have the cultivation aspects of the path. Right effort, relaxed diligence, meaning you don't want to be too tight and you don't want to be too relaxed, somewhere in between, the middle way. Right effort also includes abandoning unwholesome states of mind, hateful states of mind, desirous states of mind, states of mind that lead to more suffering, not less, and cultivating happiness in your own experience and connection through compassion and friendliness. Right mindfulness, again, a middle way approach to mindfulness, sensing into the body during the day, your feeling, your states of mind, what comes into your experience moment by moment. And lastly, right concentration. And right concentration is, it's not about just focusing on one thing and becoming super one-pointed, but rather it's about unifying and stabilizing the mind so that you set the stage for insight into these Four Noble Truths. And it's not about being at a distance from your experience, but actually staying present and intimate with things as they arise. And so the good news is that I've skimmed over these, but you'll hear from the other teachers on each of the aspects of the Eightfold Path. And I think I probably said enough tonight. But what I would say, just to round it off, is that after hearing the Four Noble Truths, the ascetics who had rejected the Buddha initially immediately understood his teaching and attained what we call stream entry, which is deep, deep absorption. This is the first stage of awakening. And this moment gave the Buddha confidence that others will understand this teaching. And over the following weeks, various other ascetics attained this deep level of stream entry. And as they matured further, the Buddha then taught the discourse on non-self. And this was said to be a deeper type of insight that he offered, and something that hopefully we'll be able to explore together in due course. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention this evening. And I'd love to hear from you in relation to how that landed, and if there are any aspects of the path or the Four Noble Truths